the moment knowledge became authority. There was a time when strength decided truth, because the loudest voice and the strongest body carried the most influence in a world ruled by survival. To understand when knowledge became authority, we must return to a period when leadership came from action, not understanding, and when experience mattered only if it could be demonstrated immediately. Early humans followed those who could protect, hunt, or intimidate. The hierarchy of the group was physical. Dominance was expressed through force, speed, and endurance. The individual who could act most effectively in the moment of crisis held the group's attention and trust. Knowing something was useless unless it showed results right away. Wisdom, without proof, carried no weight. Power lived in the body, not the mind. An elder who could explain why a river flooded held no advantage over a younger member who could carry the group across it. The immediacy of survival left no room for delayed returns on understanding. Knowledge, in its earliest form, was invisible and therefore powerless. But slowly, something changed. Humans began noticing that some people understood patterns others did not. They predicted danger, remembered outcomes, explained causes. Their value appeared before action. These individuals did not need to be the strongest or the fastest. They contributed something different, a capacity to interpret what was happening and project what might happen next. Their contribution was cognitive rather than physical. Advice began saving lives. Insight prevented mistakes. Knowledge started producing results without force. The person who remembered that certain berries caused illness prevented harm without lifting a hand. The person who recognized weather patterns before a storm arrived created time for preparation. Knowledge became functional in ways that strength alone could not replicate. This was a quiet shift. People began listening before acting. Trust moved from strength to understanding. The mind began competing with the body. The transition was gradual, not a revolution, but a slow reweighting of what the group valued. Physical capacity remained essential, but it was no longer sufficient. Understanding offered something that action could not: prevention, preparation, and the reduction of unnecessary cost. Knowledge stopped being private experience. It became influence. And once understanding could guide behavior without physical dominance, authority found a new foundation, not in power, but in knowing. As knowledge gained authority, it began reshaping how power was earned and maintained, because once understanding could guide action, force was no longer the only path to leadership. People who could explain outcomes gained trust before events unfolded. They were consulted, listened to, followed. Prediction became influence, and explanation became control. The individual who could say what would happen and why it would happen occupied a position of authority that had not existed in the purely physical hierarchy. Their power derived not from what they could do, but from what they could understand. This changed social structure. Authority shifted from those who acted fastest to those who understood best. Experience mattered, but interpretation mattered more. Knowing why something happened became as important as surviving it. The explanatory dimension of knowledge added a layer of value that pure experience lacked. Two individuals might survive the same event, but the one who could explain it held greater influence over the group's future behavior. Knowledge also became transferable. It could be taught, repeated, and preserved. Power no longer vanished when a leader fell. It could be passed forward through learning. This transferability was transformative. Physical dominance dies with the individual. Knowledge survives through transmission. The group that could accumulate and share understanding across generations gained a compounding advantage over groups that relied solely on the abilities of their current members. But this shift introduced imbalance. Those who controlled knowledge could withhold it. Understanding became currency. Ignorance became dependence. The same transferability that made knowledge powerful also made it a tool of control. Access to understanding could be granted or denied, creating asymmetries of power that had no precedent in the physical hierarchy. Institutions formed around information. Councils, schools, and records began shaping decision-making. Authority moved away from individuals and into systems built on knowledge. The formalization of knowledge into institutions represented a fundamental change in how power was structured. Authority became positional rather than personal, derived from access to accumulated understanding rather than from individual capability. Yet knowledge was not neutral. It reflected perspective, bias, and context. What was taught shaped reality. What was excluded disappeared. The selection of which knowledge to preserve and transmit was itself an exercise of power, one that determined not just what people knew, but what they believed was possible. This created a new kind of tension. Trust moved from strength to understanding, but understanding could be shaped. The same mechanism that made knowledge authoritative also made it vulnerable to distortion. Authority based on knowledge was authority based on interpretation, and interpretations could be influenced by interests that had nothing to do with truth. Knowledge had become power, and power was learning how to protect itself. As knowledge solidified into authority, conflict followed, because once understanding determined power, controlling knowledge became as important as discovering it. Those who defined what counted as knowledge gained influence over belief, behavior, and legitimacy. Certain explanations were elevated, others were dismissed. Truth began filtering through permission. The gatekeeping function that emerged around knowledge was not incidental. It was structural. Access to knowledge was regulated because access to knowledge was access to power. This reshaped institutions. Schools taught approved ideas. Traditions preserved selected knowledge. Records favored particular perspectives. Authority was reinforced not through force, but through repetition and credibility. The institutional reproduction of knowledge created a self-reinforcing cycle in which established understanding was continually validated by the systems that depended on it. Questioning knowledge became dangerous. Doubt threatened stability. Those who challenged accepted understanding risked exclusion, punishment, or silence, even when evidence supported them. The social cost of questioning established knowledge was often higher than the cost of maintaining a false belief, creating a powerful disincentive against revision. Yet progress depended on challenge. New discoveries disrupted old explanations. Observation conflicted with doctrine. Authority resisted change, while reality continued unfolding. The tension between established knowledge and emerging evidence became one of the central dynamics of human intellectual history, playing out repeatedly across every domain of understanding. This created a deep tension. Knowledge advanced by questioning, but power survived by certainty. The very force that created authority also threatened it. The most productive form of knowledge, the kind that corrects itself through challenge, was also the most threatening to the power structures that knowledge had created. Humans learned that knowing was never neutral. Information could liberate or control. Education could empower or limit. Understanding could illuminate or blind. The dual nature of knowledge as both a tool of empowerment and a mechanism of control was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The struggle was no longer about who was strongest. It was about whose knowledge defined reality. And that struggle was pushing toward a decisive moment. The climax of knowledge becoming authority was not understanding itself, but control over what was accepted as truth. Because once societies agreed that knowledge justified power, deciding what counted as knowledge became the ultimate form of influence. Authority no longer needed force. It needed legitimacy, and legitimacy was granted by the appearance of understanding. Ideas shaped laws. Explanations guided behavior. Expertise commanded obedience. People followed not because they were threatened, but because they were convinced. The shift from coercive authority to persuasive authority was one of the most consequential transitions in human social organization. This shift built civilizations. Medicine improved. Technology advanced. Education spread. Knowledge allowed humanity to solve problems strength never could. The accumulated understanding of generations, preserved and transmitted through institutions, produced capabilities that no individual could have achieved alone. But it also introduced danger. When authority fused too tightly with knowledge, questioning felt like betrayal. Doubt became destabilizing. Power protected itself by protecting certain ideas. The entanglement of authority and knowledge created conditions in which the pursuit of truth and the maintenance of power could work at cross purposes. Even today, this tension remains. We trust experts. We rely on systems of knowledge. Yet we struggle with misinformation, bias, and competing truths. Knowledge gives power, but power decides which knowledge rises. The moment knowledge became authority, humanity gained a new way to govern the world, and a new responsibility to question what it believes. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The